before John George ever crawled into the ruins of that Japanese bunker near Point Cruz. His war had already been shaped by something simple, a bolt-action rifle he bought with his own money, and a belief that one good marksman could change a battlefield. John B. George grew up in the American Midwest, the kind of farm and small-town world where a rifle was just another tool. By his early 20s, he was not just good with a gun. He was one of the best shots in Illinois. Before the war, he served with the 132nd Infantry of the Illinois National Guard and spent his weekends on rifle ranges instead of dance halls. He won state-level competitions, ringing steel and punching tight groups at distances that made most men squint. When the Illinois Guard was federalized after Pearl Harbor, George went with it. The 132nd became part of the American Division. Training shifted from calm rifle ranges to muddy camps, full of rumor and rushed preparation. Most men thought about pay, leave, and when they might ship out. George thought about ballistics. The U.S. Army was issuing the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that was tough, reliable, and easy to use under stress. George respected it. In his eyes, it was the best general-issue rifle in the world. But he also knew something else. A standard-issue gun built for millions of soldiers would never be perfect for one obsessed marksman. So he did something unusual for a junior officer. He ordered his own rifle. He picked a Winchester Model 70, the kind of high-grade sporting rifle deer hunters drooled over in catalogs. It had a smooth Moser-style action, a good barrel, and the potential for the kind of precision George wanted. He mounted a Lyman Alaskan scope on it, a low-power optic by modern standards, but rugged and clear enough to pick out a man's head in deep brush. 2 years of National Guard pay vanished into that rifle. To most officers, it looked like a rich man's toy. When the 132nd moved to Camp Forest in Tennessee, George's pride and joy followed in a wooden crate. The unit armorers raised their eyebrows. One of them is said to have asked if George planned to hunt deer or Germans. The other company officers gave it nicknames: Mail Order Sweetheart, Sporting Rifle, The Toy. No one was laughing when they sailed for the Pacific. The rifle did not make the first trip. Like a piece of lost luggage, it missed the boat. George shipped out with nothing but standard gear, while the Model 70 sat in a warehouse back in Illinois, coated in thick Cosmoline grease. The 132nd reached the South Pacific, and then the island whose name would haunt a generation: Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was the first big Allied ground offensive against Japan. The Marines had landed there in August 1942, seized the half-finished airfield at Lunga Point, and renamed it Henderson Field. For months they had clung to that strip of ground, while Japanese troops tried again and again to push them into the sea. The American Division, including the 132nd Infantry, arrived as reinforcement and then relief. They were thrown almost straight into the hills and jungle. By December, attention turned to a long, broken ridge inland. Mount Austin and the fortified strong point the Americans called the Gifu. Japanese troops had dug in on that high ground with bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and the kind of fanatical stubbornness that meant only one thing: this would be slow, bloody work. The Battle of Mount Austin and its satellite ridges would run from mid-December until late January and cost the 132nd well over 100 men killed and hundreds more wounded or sick. Wikipedia: George fought through that nightmare jungle with the same M1 rifle as everyone else. His private Winchester, somewhere in the American logistics system, had still never been fired at an enemy. It finally caught up with him near the end of the Mount Austin fighting. One late December day on Guadalcanal, A supply sergeant handed him a crate marked "Fragile." Inside, under stiff paper and grease, lay the rifle and scope that had seemed like such a luxury back in Tennessee. George stripped the Cosmoline by lamplight, wiped the bore until the patches came out clean, checked the scope mounts with the care of a watchmaker. On paper, his choice made no sense for combat. The Model 70 was a bolt-action with a 5-round magazine. The M1 was semi-automatic with 8. The scoped rifle and mount added weight. It required more delicate handling, and there were no formal sniper slots in his infantry battalion. The table of organization did not recognize men like him. His battalion commander recognized something else: numbers. By January 1943, the main Japanese positions on Mount Austin were crumbling. Japanese High Command had already decided to evacuate Guadalcanal under a plan they called Operation K. Their surviving troops were pulling back toward the west of the island, filtering through the jungle toward places like Point Cruz and Cape Esperance, where destroyers would try to pick them up under cover of darkness. Wikipedia: as they withdrew, they left behind something dangerous: snipers. The coastal groves west of the Matanica River were full of thick trees, coconuts, banyans with sprawling roots and huge branches, palms with curtains of fronds. Japanese marksmen climbed these giants before dawn, built nests of branches and leaves, and waited. They used Arisaka rifles, some fitted with scopes, and they knew every fold of that coastal jungle. In a span of roughly 3 days, Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz area killed well over a dozen men from the American ranks, including soldiers from the 132nd Infantry. They hit water parties at creeks, patrols moving along trails, men who thought they were in dead ground. A single rifle, shot from high in a tree, would crack across the grove. A man would drop. By the time anyone could react, the shooter had melted back into the leaves. Fear spread faster than malaria. Men hugged cover. Work parties slowed down. Every large tree became a suspect. No one liked filling canteens when there might be a ghost with a rifle watching from somewhere above. One night in January, George was called to battalion headquarters. The commander laid it out with no drama. The snipers were killing his men. A battalion that had survived Mount Austin's bunkers was now being bled out on what should have been safer ground. He needed someone who could see and shoot better than the enemy. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could do anything besides win trophies. George did not brag. He did not need to. He had the records to prove his skill long before the war. And on Guadalcanal, he had already shown that under fire, he stayed calm, picked his shots, and hit what he aimed at. The commander gave him a simple order: take the Winchester, find where the snipers were operating, and see if he could do something about it. If the experiment failed, they would go back to patrols, artillery, and blind fire into the groves. If it worked, maybe the battalion could move again without men dropping one by one. Early on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, George crawled into the shattered concrete and earth of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. The position looked out over coconut and banyan trees, where intelligence and bitter experience said the Japanese liked to work. The air was heavy and already warm, the pounding of surf mixed with insect noise and the distant thud of artillery. He was alone, no spotter, no radio man, just a canteen, spare ammunition, and the rifle everyone had mocked. The Lyman Alaskan scope had low magnification by modern standards, but in that jungle, it made the difference between guessing and knowing. Through the glass, shadows sharpened. Small movements that would vanish to the naked eye stood out. A bird taking off. A branch shifting with no wind. A darker patch among leaves that might be bark. Or might be a man, hour by hour. George scanned, top to bottom, left to right. He let his breathing settle into a slow rhythm. Time stretched. The constant noise of the jungle faded into background. There was only the field of view and the knowledge that somewhere out there were men who had already taken the lives of his friends. Then he saw it, high in a banyan, more than 2 football fields away. A branch twitched in a way that did not match the rest of the tree. No breeze, no bird, just a tiny, wrong movement. He froze, watched, waited. The shape resolved. A man crouched at the fork where thick limbs met, facing toward the American trail. George adjusted his hold. The Model 70's trigger broke cleanly, the way he had tuned it back in the States. He let the crosshairs settle, pressed straight back, and felt the rifle buck into his shoulder. The shot cracked across the grove. Far away, the dark shape in the tree jerked. Then it fell, crashing through branches, dropping the height of a tall building to the ground. The bunker's dust drifted back to the floor. George worked the bolt by feel and stayed on the glass. 1 shot. 1 sniper. For the first time on Guadalcanal, the private rifle had paid for itself. But Japanese snipers rarely worked alone. And somewhere, in those same trees, a second pair of eyes was now searching for the man who had just turned the hunt around. When the first sniper hit the ground, the grove went still. Not silent. Nothing on Guadalcanal was ever silent, but still in the way predators go still when the balance shifts. George kept his cheek on the stock and let the reticle sweep the branches. He knew the second man would be close. Snipers did not operate alone. One pulled the trigger. One watched. And the watcher would now be searching for the source of that single, heavy shot. For long minutes, George saw nothing. The air shimmered with heat. Mosquitoes drifted across his scope like tiny blurs. A distant mortar thumped in the hills. Still he waited, patient in the way only a trained marksman could be patient. He had learned calm long before the war. Calm was the space between life and disaster. At 9:43, something shifted in a tree north of the first kill. Not much. Just the shape of a man moving down the trunk, slow and careful, as if he believed he could still escape unseen. George exhaled. The man jumped down one branch, then another. George fired. The crack of the Winchester rolled across the grove. The second sniper fell backwards, his rifle clattering ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 bodies. The pattern of death in the grove had changed direction. By late morning, the Japanese recognized it. At 11:21, a round snapped into the sandbag half a hand's length from George's skull. The blast of dust stung his face. He rolled hard against the interior wall of the ruined bunker. The shooter had fired from the southwest, farther out, adjusting angles and taking a longer, cautious shot. A professional, one who had waited until George revealed just a sliver of himself. He stayed down for a full 3 minutes. Then he eased back to the firing slit, slowly, inch by inch, until he could bring the scope up again. The shooter had moved, but not far. Most snipers did not abandon a tree completely after 1 shot unless they had to, and the banyan the shot came from was thick, full of dark folds of bark, where a crouched man could hide. When George found the faint silhouette, it was 70 feet above the ground, tucked into a cradle of limbs like a shadow. George placed the crosshairs on the dark shape, let his breath fall out, and squeezed. Another body slumped. 3 enemies down now, others still watching. By noon, George had accounted for 5 of them. Word spread through the battalion like wildfire. Men who had once smirked at the Winchester now walked more confidently along the trails. Water parties moved without flinching at every rustle of leaves. George did not let the attention touch him. He refused observers. Extra men meant movement. Movement meant a muzzle flash. A muzzle flash meant death. But the Japanese were learning. After the 5th sniper fell, the grove changed. The trees went still in a different way, an intelligent way. The enemy realized who they were facing. Not a lucky shot, but a marksman hunting them with method and patience. They adapted. They froze during daylight. They shifted at dawn and dusk. They played the waiting game. George stayed in the bunker scanning and saw nothing until the light faded. At dusk, he returned to headquarters. Captain Morris, once amused by the sporting rifle, now showed only urgency. Back at dawn, he told George. George nodded. His face said everything. January 23rd began under a sheet of tropical rain. It hammered the bunker roofs. It turned the trails into streams. It erased footprints and blurred the edges of every leaf. George sat in the bunker with the Winchester resting across his knees. The downpour hid movement, and movement was when snipers climbed. He waited, feeling the hours ticking, feeling the jungle breathe around him. When the rain eased toward mid-morning, the grove slowly came back into view. Gray light cut through the mist. George brought the rifle up. At 9:12, he found the 6th sniper. The man had climbed during the storm, using the roar of rain to hide the sound of branches bending under his weight. He was 290 yards out, farther than any shot so far, but George read the wind, shifted his aim, and fired. The figure toppled. A delayed echo rolled through the trees. For the first time, the Japanese responded with more than rifle fire. At 9:57, the first mortar round landed short, far short, but close enough that George felt the concussion against the bunker wall. The next landed closer. The third would land on top of him. He ran. The bunker behind him vanished under a geyser of mud and shattered concrete. When he looked back, only a crater and drifting smoke remained. The Japanese had triangulated his shots. They were not just hunting, they were exterminating. George slid behind a fallen tree 120 yards north of the wrecked bunker and settled into its shadow. And from there, the hunt began again. That afternoon he killed 2 more snipers. One was almost a silhouette against the sky, perched high where the setting sun outlined him before he realized his mistake. George fired before the man could shift, and the body tumbled through the branches. By evening, George had 8 confirmed kills in 2 days. 12 shots fired, 4 misses. No wasted ammunition, no rushed shots, just precision. Captain Morris met him again at headquarters. "Back tomorrow," he said quietly. "We still have men dying out there." George cleaned his rifle late into the night, rubbing mud from the Winchester's action, running oily patches through the barrel until each one came out clean. 11 known Japanese snipers had operated in the groves. He had accounted for 8. The last 3 would be the most dangerous. They were the survivors. They had watched friends fall. They had adapted, and now they were hunting him as much as he was hunting them. Rain began at 4 in the morning. George did not sleep. When dawn finally came, he moved to a different firing position, a line of broken rocks the Marines had once used as a gun pit. The shift was deliberate. The remaining snipers had intelligence of where he'd been. They would expect him to return. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. From the rocks, the grove spread out before him like a dark green maze, and somewhere inside that maze, The next duel was already waiting. From the rocky outcrop overlooking the coconut groves, George settled into a new rhythm. The rain faded to a thin mist, and shapes in the trees sharpened inch by inch. He swept the branches slowly, letting every movement sink into his mind. By the time the light fully returned, he already knew the grove better than he had the day before. At 8:17, he spotted the next threat. A sniper positioned low in a palm tree, wrapped in drooping fronds. Too low, too exposed from above. It did not fit. The best Japanese marksmen did not choose such obvious nests. George studied it, then widened his search. For 11 long minutes he checked tree after tree, branch after branch, looking for what experience told him must be there. At 8:28, he found it. The real sniper, 90 feet up in a banyan northwest of the palm. Perfect cover, perfect line of sight to George's old firing position. The man in the palm was bait. The killer sat above and behind, waiting for George to take the obvious shot. George turned their trap back on them. He fired at the decoy first. Before the body fell through the fronds, he had already swung to the banyan. He waited for the slightest shift, just enough to confirm the sniper was reacting to the sound, then fired again. Both men toppled the 9th and 10th kills, but the shots revealed his new position. Within seconds, a Japanese machine gun erupted from the trees, tearing into the rocks where he had been minutes earlier. George sprinted east and dove into a drainage ditch. The mud swallowed him up to the chest. He held his rifle upright to keep water out of the barrel and waited, still as stone, while bursts of gunfire raked the stones behind him. After a minute, the grove fell quiet. He crawled north until he reached a shallow shell crater, half filled with rainwater. He slipped into it until only his eyes remained above the surface. Through the ripple of water and drifting mist, he resumed scanning. One sniper remained, the best of them, the survivor who had watched 10 others die. George swept the tree line again and again until at 9:47 he realized why he could not find him. The last sniper wasn't in a tree. He was on the ground, crawling through vines and ferns, moving toward the rocks where George had been earlier. George sank lower in the water. The crater's edge blocked his angle, and to rise meant exposing himself. He waited. The Japanese sniper advanced, slow and patient, stopping often to study the ground. He was tracking George's escape route from the machine gun attack. At 10:03, the sniper climbed into the rocks and took a position facing east, the direction George would have fled if he had reacted like anyone else. For a moment, the man's back was fully exposed, a perfect shot. But George held his fire. It was too easy, too deliberate. He scanned again and found a second man 70 yards northwest, hidden behind a fallen log, rifle aimed at the drainage ditch. A 2-man sweep. A final trap. George lowered himself deeper into the cold water. Both Japanese soldiers moved east, searching for him. They passed the crater without noticing the barely visible eyes watching them. When they turned their backs, he rose, aimed, and fired. One man collapsed. The second spun, raising his rifle, but George's next shot struck first. The 11th sniper was dead. The last hunt was over, but the grove was not finished with him. Voices rose in the trees, 6, maybe more, closing in behind the shots. A recovery patrol or a search team drawn by the gunfire. George lowered himself back into the crater, water rising to his chin. The Winchester stayed vertical. Mud swallowed his legs. He waited in absolute silence as the Japanese reached the first 2 bodies and began shouting. They found his tracks. A soldier appeared on the crater rim. Their eyes met. George fired through the water. The man toppled backward. 2 more rushed in. George fired twice more, dropping both. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, bullets smashing into the lip of the crater. The Japanese could not see him yet. They were firing at sound and movement, but he knew the ring would close fast. He slid out the far side of the crater, crawled 10 yards, then ran for a fallen tree. Rifle fire followed him, snapping branches and throwing dirt into his face. He dove behind the trunk and brought the scope up. 2 Japanese soldiers were advancing on the crater. George aimed and shot the lead man. The second dove for cover, shouting. More voices pushed from behind. Another group was swinging wide to flank him. He had only 2 rounds left, and no way to fight a half-squad of infantry with a bolt-action rifle. So he ran again, low, fast, crashing through vines and mud, sprinting until his chest burned. After nearly a minute, he threw himself into a dry crater and waited. The jungle settled. No pursuit. The patrol had stayed near the bodies. He checked his rifle. 2 rounds, no spare clips. The rest were lost in the first crater. He angled northeast, moving slow, always in cover. At 11:13, he reached an American perimeter and was challenged by a Marine sentry. Moments later, he walked into battalion headquarters, caked in mud, exhausted, but alive. Captain Morris asked one question: how many? George gave the count. 11 snipers in 4 days, 12 shots fired at them, 11 hits. Later that afternoon, division headquarters called him in. He expected discipline for working alone and using a private weapon. Instead, they asked a single question. Could he train other men to do what he had done? George said yes, but only if he kept his Winchester. They agreed. The rifle that had once been mocked as a mail-order toy would become the pattern for a new sniper section. Training would begin in just a few days. By the time George stepped out of division headquarters, the sun had dropped low over Henderson Field. The air smelled of dust, spilled fuel, and the damp rot of the jungle. He carried the Winchester in one hand, a packet of written orders in the other. For the first time since January 22nd, he wasn't being asked to hunt. He was being asked to teach. The order was simple. Build a sniper section, train men, develop tactics, use whatever equipment the regiment could spare. It was a strange request in an army that still didn't officially recognize snipers in its tables of organization. But Guadalcanal had forced changes on everyone. Commanders no longer cared about theory. They cared about what worked. And George had proven what worked. 2 days later, on January 27th, he stood on a rough firing line 2 miles east of Henderson Field. A clearing hacked out of the jungle, targets nailed to tree trunks, sandbags piled into crude benches, and 40 infantrymen waiting for him. Some looked curious. Some looked skeptical. All of them carried Springfield rifles topped with long, unearthly scopes. 14 of them spread among the group, shared in rotation. These rifles had been left behind by Marine units earlier in the campaign. The scopes were long, thin, and fragile-looking, but deadly when handled right. George had tested each one the previous night. The optics were clear. The mounts held. The rifles shot straight. He opened the first morning with something simple. Breathing. Not glamorous, not heroic, just breath. If your breath is wrong, he told them, everything that comes after is wrong too. The men listened. They trusted results more than words, and they had all heard what he'd done in the Point Cruz groves. George showed them how a slow exhale steadied the reticle, how timing a shot with natural pauses in the breath could turn a shaky aim into a clean trigger break. Then they practiced for hours. Next came trigger control, smooth pressure, no jerking, no anticipation, rifle and soldier acting as one. Some men learned it fast, others fought their own nerves. The jungle sun beat down. Sweat turned the rifles slick. Mosquitoes buzzed around their faces. But George stayed patient. Every mistake became a lesson. Every good shot earned a nod. On the second day, he taught wind, not by charts or formulas, by feel, by the sway of leaves, by thin curls of dust drifting across the range. He placed small scraps of paper at intervals down the firing lane so they could watch how each gust changed direction. The men saw that wind didn't move the same on the ground as in the middle branches. They learned to hold off targets by inches at close range and feet at longer ones. On the third day, he pushed them out of comfort. No benches, no sandbags, no easy rests. He made them shoot from awkward ground, from kneeling positions in tangled roots, from prone positions half submerged in damp soil. "You won't find a perfect firing line in the jungle," he said. "You'll find mud. You'll find rocks. You'll find angles no textbook ever wrote down. Use what's there. Create a solid platform from nothing." By the end of that day, George watched the groups tighten. Misses grew fewer. Confidence grew quietly, without boasting. Out of 40 men, 32 could put rounds on a man-sized target at 300 yards under field conditions. That was enough. He divided them into 16 two-man teams, one shooter, one spotter, both roles interchangeable. The spotter carried binoculars and a garand for close protection. He called ranges, read wind, and kept the shooter aware of movement the scope couldn't catch. After a kill, the men switched roles. Each man needed to be capable of both jobs. No single point of failure, no star shooter. Teams survived. Individuals didn't. On February the 1st, George led 4 teams into the field. Not a range, not a controlled space. Real jungle, real targets. Intelligence reported small Japanese groups still scattered west of the Guadalcanal River, stragglers covering the final stages of the Japanese evacuation under Operation K. These were not snipers. They were tired infantry trying to reach pickup points on the western tip of the island. But they were still dangerous. George and his new spotter, Corporal Hayes, took up a position above a narrow trail. Dense vines hung overhead, turning the world into layers of green shadow. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier stepped onto the path, unaware of the eyes studying him through 2 sets of optics. Hayes confirmed the target. George fired. 1 shot. Clean. The man fell. More came later. Singles and pairs drifting along the trail, each one careful, each one alert. But the sniper teams worked as George had taught them, unseen, steady, silent. By midday, George and Hayes had dropped 7 men with 8 shots. Only 1 miss pulled half an inch left by an unpredictable crosswind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day, 0 American casualties. Across the next week, the sniper section grew sharper. They learned the jungle's light patterns. They learned how sound moved through the groves. They learned how to relocate without exposing themselves. And they learned that their rifles were not magic. They required discipline, teamwork, and patience. By February 9th, the Japanese evacuation was almost complete. Destroyers had carried thousands away under darkness. American forces pushed west to block the routes. But most battles were now short, desperate skirmishes. In those same days, Georgia's sniper teams accounted for 74 confirmed kills, Conservative tallies always counted only when bodies were physically observed. Sniper doctrine demanded honesty. No guesses. No claims without proof. On the morning of February 7th, everything changed. George was moving with Hayes and another team near the Tanamba River when a sharp shot cracked from the brush. George felt the impact. Like a hammer striking his left shoulder, it spun him half around. He hit the ground hard. Hayes dragged him into cover while another sniper team scanned for the shooter. A medic arrived minutes later, pressing gauze against the wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through muscle, missing bone and arteries by sheer luck. Pain flared up his arm, and cold sweat broke across his forehead. He knew instantly he was done. Not forever, but for now. He was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and stitched him up. They ordered rest. They ordered him off the line for weeks. George protested once, only once. The doctor gave him a look that told him the argument was over. While he recovered, Guadalcanal fell quiet. American troops reached Cape Esperance on February 9th. It was empty. The Japanese were gone. After 6 months of blood, the island was finally secure. George's sniper section, only 12 days old, had written its own small chapter in that final push. 74 confirmed kills. Not a single man lost during sniper operations. The regiment took notice. Division took notice. Colonel Ferry submitted George's name for a Bronze Star. But the war had more in store. While George lay in his hospital cot, listening to distant engines and rain on canvas, new orders were moving across desks thousands of miles away. The Army needed men who could operate deep in the jungle, far beyond supply lines, with small teams and precise fire. Men who understood patience, terrain, silence. George didn't know it yet, but his next battlefield would not be Guadalcanal's beaches. It would be the deep, punishing labyrinth of Burma, and the unit he would join had no official name. The men simply called themselves something else. Merrill's Marauders. By the time George stepped out of division headquarters, the sun had dropped low over Henderson Field. The air smelled of dust, spilled fuel, and the damp rot of the jungle. He carried the Winchester in one hand, a packet of written orders in the other. For the first time since January 22nd, he wasn't being asked to hunt. He was being asked to teach. The order was simple. Build a sniper section, train men, develop tactics, use whatever equipment the regiment could spare. It was a strange request in an army that still didn't officially recognize snipers in its tables of organization. But Guadalcanal had forced changes on everyone. Commanders no longer cared about theory. They cared about what worked. And George had proven what worked. 2 days later, on January 27th, he stood on a rough firing line 2 miles east of Henderson Field. A clearing hacked out of the jungle. Targets nailed to tree trunks. Sandbags piled into crude benches. And 40 infantrymen waiting for him. Some looked curious. Some looked skeptical. All of them carried Springfield rifles topped with long, unearthly scopes. 14 of them spread among the group, shared in rotation. These rifles had been left behind by Marine units earlier in the campaign. The scopes were long, thin, and fragile-looking, but deadly when handled right. George had tested each one the previous night. The optics were clear. The mounts held. The rifles shot straight. He opened the first morning with something simple. Breathing. Not glamorous, not heroic, just breath. If your breath is wrong, he told them, everything that comes after is wrong too. The men listened. They trusted results more than words, and they had all heard what he'd done in the Point Cruz groves. George showed them how a slow exhale steadied the reticle, how timing a shot with natural pauses in the breath could turn a shaky aim into a clean trigger break. Then they practiced for hours. Next came trigger control. Smooth pressure, no jerking, no anticipation. Rifle and soldier acting as one. Some men learned it fast. Others fought their own nerves. The jungle sun beat down. Sweat turned the rifles slick. Mosquitoes buzzed around their faces. But George stayed patient. Every mistake became a lesson. Every good shot earned a nod. On the second day he taught wind, not by charts or formulas, by feel, by the sway of leaves, by thin curls of dust drifting across the range. He placed small scraps of paper at intervals down the firing lane so they could watch how each gust changed direction. The men saw that wind didn't move the same on the ground as in the middle branches. They learned to hold off targets by inches at close range and feet at longer ones. On the third day, he pushed them out of comfort. No benches, no sandbags, no easy rests. He made them shoot from awkward ground, from kneeling positions in tangled roots, from prone positions half submerged in damp soil. "You won't find a perfect firing line in the jungle," he said. "You'll find mud. You'll find rocks. You'll find angles no textbook ever wrote down. Use what's there. Create a solid platform from nothing." By the end of that day, George watched the groups tighten. Misses grew fewer. Confidence grew quietly, without boasting. Out of 40 men, 32 could put rounds on a man-sized target at 300 yards under field conditions. That was enough. He divided them into 16 two-man teams, one shooter, one spotter, both roles interchangeable. The spotter carried binoculars and a garand for close protection. He called ranges, read wind, and kept the shooter aware of movement the scope couldn't catch. After a kill, the men switched roles. Each man needed to be capable of both jobs. No single point of failure, no star shooter. Teams survived. Individuals didn't. On February the 1st, George led 4 teams into the field. Not a range, not a controlled space. Real jungle, real targets. Intelligence reported small Japanese groups still scattered west of the Matanikau River, stragglers covering the final stages of the Japanese evacuation under Operation K. These were not snipers. They were tired infantry trying to reach pickup points on the western tip of the island, but they were still dangerous. George and his new spotter, a Corporal Hayes, took up a position above a narrow trail. Dense vines hung overhead, turning the world into layers of green shadow. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier stepped onto the path, unaware of the eyes studying him through 2 sets of optics. Hayes confirmed the target. George fired. 1 shot. Clean. The man fell. More came later. Singles and pairs drifting along the trail, each one careful, each one alert. But the sniper teams worked as George had taught them. Unseen, steady, silent. By midday, George and Hayes had dropped 7 men with 8 shots. Only 1 miss pulled half an inch left by an unpredictable crosswind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. 0 American casualties. Across the next week, the sniper section grew sharper. They learned the jungle's light patterns. They learned how sound moved through the groves. They learned how to relocate without exposing themselves. And they learned that their rifles were not magic. They required discipline, teamwork, and patience. By February 9th, the Japanese evacuation was almost complete. Destroyers had carried thousands away under darkness. American forces pushed west to block the routes. But most battles were now short, desperate skirmishes. In those same days, George's sniper teams accounted for 74 confirmed kills. Conservative tallies always counted only when bodies were physically observed. Sniper doctrine demanded honesty. No guesses, no claims without proof. On the morning of February 7th, everything changed. George was moving with Hayes and another team near the Tanamba River when a sharp shot cracked from the brush. George felt the impact, like a hammer striking his left shoulder. It spun him half around. He hit the ground hard. Hayes dragged him into cover while another sniper team scanned for the shooter. A medic arrived minutes later, pressing gauze against the wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through muscle, missing bone and arteries by sheer luck. Pain flared up his arm, and cold sweat broke across his forehead. He knew instantly he was done. Not forever, but for now. He was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and stitched him up. They ordered rest. They ordered him off the line for weeks. George protested once, only once. The doctor gave him a look that told him the argument was over. While he recovered, Guadalcanal fell quiet. American troops reached Cape Esperance on February 9th. It was empty. The Japanese were gone. After 6 months of blood, the island was finally secure. George's sniper section, only 12 days old, had written its own small chapter in that final push. 74 confirmed kills. Not a single man lost during sniper operations. The regiment took notice. Division took notice. Colonel Ferry submitted George's name for a Bronze Star. But the war had more in store. While George lay in his hospital cot, listening to distant engines and rain on canvas, new orders were moving across desks thousands of miles away. The Army needed men who could operate deep in the jungle, far beyond supply lines, with small teams and precise fire. Men who understood patience, terrain, silence. George didn't know it yet, but his next battlefield would not be Guadalcanal's beaches. It would be the deep, punishing labyrinth of Burma, and the unit he would join had no official name. The men simply called themselves something else. Merrill's Marauders. George left Guadalcanal with a healing shoulder and a reputation that traveled faster than he did. For the first time in months, he wasn't carrying a rifle across mud or scanning treetops for movement. He was being shipped to a new assignment, one wrapped in secrecy and urgency. All he knew was that the Army needed officers with jungle experience. Real experience, not textbook theory. And men who could move quietly, survive off the land, and kill at distance when needed. In March 1943, he boarded a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester traveled with him in a wooden case, wrapped in oilcloth to protect the Lyman scope from humidity and salt air. The rifle had saved him too many times to leave behind. But George already suspected it would need changes for whatever came next. When the ship reached India in early April, he joined nearly 200 American officers standing in a dusty compound, listening to a briefing that felt more like an enlistment into an entirely new war. The mission was simple in theory and brutal in practice. A long-range penetration force moving deep into northern Burma to cut Japanese supply lines, disrupt garrisons, strike airfields, and hold ground until larger forces could move in. No roads, no vehicles, no supply depots. Everything carried on backs or with pack animals. The British called this kind of warfare Chindit tactics. The U.S. version would be harder. The new unit, 3,000 men, had no official designation yet. They didn't even have a clean organizational chart. But the man chosen to lead them, Brigadier General Frank Merrill, gave them a name that stuck long before the paperwork caught up. People began calling them Merrill's Marauders. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. On paper, he was an infantry platoon leader. In reality, the officers who had read his Guadalcanal reports knew exactly what he could do. In the jungle, one precise shot could mean the difference between a column moving forward and a column trapped under machine gun fire. They didn't advertise his specialty, but they didn't hide it either. Training began immediately. India was hot, uneven, wet in some places and dusty in others, but one thing remained constant: discomfort. The Marauders marched through hills, waded rivers, slept on whatever patch of ground wasn't full of ants. They were taught to abandon anything they couldn't carry for a week straight. Their missions would involve marches measured not in miles but in hundreds of miles, and George realized something very quickly. His Winchester was too heavy. Back on Guadalcanal, he could afford a few extra pounds. He moved from firing position to firing position, never far from supply lines. Burma would not allow that. The Marauders were expected to move all day, every day, under a rucksack, loaded with rations, ammunition, medical supplies, a bedroll, machete, entrenching tool, and whatever else kept a man alive. Every ounce mattered. So he began modifying his rifle. First he swapped the Lyman Alaskan scope for a lighter Weaver 330. It had the same low magnification, 2.5 power, but weighed less. Then he replaced the wooden stock with a synthetic one. It was a small change, but every ounce saved meant more endurance on the trail. In total, he shaved nearly a pound off the rifle. Still not light, but lighter enough to matter. He kept the bolt-action system, kept the tuned trigger, kept the barrel he trusted. The Winchester had character now. It wasn't a showpiece anymore. It was a tool shaped by war. By late February 1944, the Marauders began their march into Burma. Their route was brutal. Mountain ridges that rose like walls, valleys choked with vines, swamps where the mud swallowed mules whole. They moved at night sometimes, in rain that fell so hard it erased the world beyond a few feet. Malaria hit men in waves. Dysentery followed. Boots fell apart. Uniforms rotted on their bodies. Men lost weight, strength, sleep, everything except determination. In the first week alone, they covered more than 80 miles. In the second, they lost mules to broken legs and exhaustion. In the third, men collapsed on the trail and had to be dragged to shade. And always, somewhere in the hills, the Japanese watched. The Marauders fought 12 skirmishes in their first month inside Burma. Quick, violent clashes where the jungle swallowed sound and visibility. These weren't open-field battles. They were sudden fights where you saw an enemy soldier for only a second before he vanished behind ferns. George used the Winchester sparingly, 3 times in 3 months. But each shot counted. The first was at a river crossing. A Japanese officer stood on the far bank directing troops. The distance was long, over 400 yards, but George read the light wind pushing across the water, steadied the reticle, and fired. The officer fell. The entire Japanese unit froze, unsure of where the shot had come from. The Marauders slipped away clean. The second shot came against a machine gun nest dug into a hillside. Its fire pinned down a platoon and threatened to halt the entire column. George lay behind a fallen tree, judged the angle, and sent a single round into the gunner. The nest went silent. The column moved again. The third was a sniper, one Japanese marksman who had found a perch above a trail and held up a moving patrol. George spotted the faint outline through the leaves, took a breath, and dropped him with 1 shot. 3 engagements, 3 bullets, 3 lives taken with quiet precision. The Marauders kept moving. They marched more than 700 miles. They lost more men to fever than bullets. Rations shrank. Water became hard to find. Malaria thinned the ranks until some companies had barely a fraction of their original strength. But they kept going because their mission mattered. Capture the Myitkyina airfield, the key to supplying Chinese forces and cutting Japanese control over northern Burma. On May 17th, exhausted and nearly unable to fight, they reached the outskirts of the airfield. With help from Kachin guides and supporting Chinese units, they launched a surprise attack. By that evening, the airstrip was in American hands, the only airfield taken behind enemy lines in the entire Pacific War. It was a victory bought with endurance, not firepower. The Marauders had done the impossible, but they could not stay. They were too sick, too depleted, too battered by months in the jungle without rest. By the time reinforcements arrived, fewer than 1,000 of the original 3,000 men were still fit to walk. Some historians would later say the unit was destroyed by success. Their own achievement had broken them. George survived Burma. The Winchester survived with him, though he used it only a handful of times. The dense jungle made long-range shooting rare. Most fights were ambushes at 30 feet, not 300 yards, but the rifle had served its purpose. George had proved again, just as he had on Guadalcanal, that one man with skill and discipline could shape the path of an entire unit. By June, the Marauders were evacuated. The unit disbanded. George was sent back to the United States for reassignment. He had fought 2 completely different wars, one from treetops, one through mountains, and in both he had carried the same rifle. The next part of his story would not involve bullets or jungle trails. It would involve classrooms, training fields, and the next generation of soldiers who would learn from everything he had seen. But the war still had one more chapter waiting for him when he returned home. When George sailed back to the United States in the summer of 1944, he was not the same man who had stepped onto Guadalcanal 18 months earlier. The jungle had carved weight off his frame and years off his youth. Burma had taught him how thin the line was between survival and collapse, but he carried one thing that had stayed constant from start to finish: a scuffed, battle-worn Winchester Model 70 wrapped in oilcloth. He arrived at Fort Benning with healing scars and a new assignment: teach officers how to fight in terrain most of them had never seen. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was vital. The U.S. Army was expanding rapidly, and thousands of new platoon leaders needed to learn how to move, shoot, and think in environments far more complicated than open fields or clean training lanes. George brought something to Fort Benning no manual could match: lived knowledge. Knowledge earned through mud, gunfire, and the silence of waiting for hours in a wet crater. He built courses around the simple lessons he had learned in 2 different jungles. A soldier survives on awareness. A leader survives on patience. A marksman survives on discipline. At Benning, he talked about the things most officers overlooked: angles of fire in thick vegetation, how sound bounces through tree canopies, how humidity changes the zero of a rifle, how patrols should pause before crossing clearings, how sunlight reflects off steel and reveals a position faster than any movement. The officers listened, not because George demanded it, but because he carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had lived through the hardest version of every lesson he taught. In quiet moments, he kept the Winchester stored in a footlocker by his bunk. He didn't bring it to the range. He didn't show it off. He didn't hang it on a wall. The rifle had earned its rest. Sometimes officers visiting his quarters would notice the wooden case and ask about it. George rarely opened it. When he did, he spoke plainly. "This is the rifle I trusted," he would say, and nothing more. The war marched on without him. Across the Pacific, Marines fought through Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Across Europe, the Allies crossed France and pushed into Germany. George trained new officers for all those front lines, but his combat days were finished. By January of 1947, the Army released him from active duty. He left the service as a lieutenant colonel, decorated with 2 bronze stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantryman badge. He had earned every medal the hard way, never through comfort or distance. Civilian life called him back to something he had set aside before the war: learning. George entered Princeton University under the GI Bill. Classrooms replaced foxholes. Books replaced rifles. Yet his mind stayed sharp in the same way, clear, disciplined, always curious. He excelled in political studies, graduating with highest honors. After Princeton, he crossed the Atlantic once more, not for war, but for scholarship. 4 years at Oxford, 4 more in British East Africa, studying regional politics and tribal institutions. Then Washington, D.C., where he worked first as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, and later as a consultant on African affairs for the State Department. Through all those years, most colleagues never knew the man behind the desk had once crawled through Burmese mud with a rifle over his head. They knew he was disciplined and steady, but not why. George didn't talk about the war, not in speeches, not in casual conversation. His memories stayed locked down, the same way he once locked the bolt of the Winchester before sliding it into its case. But in 1947, something changed. He realized the small details of jungle warfare, the specific sounds, the weight of certain rifles, the mechanics of Japanese sniping tactics would fade with time, not just for him, but for history. And George hated inaccuracy more than he hated hardship. So he began to write, not a heroic story, not a soldier's memoir meant to stir applause, but a technical account of weapons, tactics, and the realities of fighting in dense tropical terrain. He wrote for 6 months, page after page, quiet nights, early mornings, no drama, no exaggeration, just truth. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and insisted it needed to be published. George resisted at first. He believed the public wanted heroes and legends, not careful analysis of muzzle flash discipline or the way rain changes the sound profile of a rifle shot. But eventually he agreed. The book was published as Shots Fired in Anger. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't even arranged to make George look impressive. It was honest, and that honesty made it a classic. Collectors still use the book today to identify Japanese rifles brought back from the Pacific. Historians quote it because it is one of the clearest first-hand descriptions of World War II small arms ever written. Young soldiers still read it to understand why patience matters, why terrain matters, and why one well-trained marksman can change the course of an entire battalion. George lived long enough to watch everything he had learned become part of modern doctrine. The U.S. military finally created formal sniper schools, standardized optics, and trained marksmen as specialists rather than oddities. He saw the Garand give way to the M14, then the M16. He watched Vietnam bring sniping back into the spotlight. He watched the Gulf War prove that precision could matter more than volume. He saw an entire profession grow out of skills that had once been dismissed as the hobby of a man with a mail-order rifle. John B. George died on January 3, 2009, at 90 years old. He was buried quietly, without fanfare, no speeches, no documentaries, no crowds. The Winchester Model 70 that had followed him from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and back home again, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Virginia. Visitors walk past it every day. Most don't stop. To them it looks ordinary, like any other old sporting rifle. But it isn't. It is the rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves, the rifle that survived Burma, the rifle that shaped a soldier, a book, and a doctrine, the rifle that proved a calm mind and a steady trigger could turn the tide of a battlefield. And like the man who carried it, it never asked for attention. It simply did its job, and did it well.